Good evening and welcome to Sköllersta and lovely evening we're having here. It's quite warm. It must be one of the last warm days in November. We had about 10 degrees, which is extraordinary. It's almost May, one could say. We are expecting colder weather, of course. Tomorrow might be sunshine. And today we have a special guest here. We have Henrik coming all the way from Stockholm. We had a very creative time when we were up at his place and discussing, amongst other things, Jung at the grave by, I think it was Bellman.
Yeah. And Sven Hedin.
Well, not to be forgotten, the last person in Sweden to be given a title, and that was Sven Hedin in
Coat of Arms.
1920s, I think. Today we are going to continue with the Vedic theory of evolution, and it's this book that looks so innocent. It looks like a beginner's book, like if you get interested in this author's extensive work and you don't have that much time, you can buy this one. It's smaller as well. It's going to be 150 pages, 120. But looks are deceiving. I don't know what they were thinking, but this is just condensed books. And there's how many chapters? 10 chapters. I'd say that it's like 10 books in one very small book. Well, it's a big advantage to do this in lectures because the understanding comes much easier. And the last subject, this is chapter 4. We started with chapter 4 in the last lecture, 680. Now we have 681. So our listener, he didn't notice that, but you others have heard the other one. So I just let him jump in. But we were talking about creationism, and we were talking about ID, which is intelligent design, and problems with those theories, but also problems with, in Sweden, most current idea, at least from believers, and that is that the evolution is governed or injected by God. That's 3 different beliefs: creationism, intelligent design, and the idea that evolution is started or governed by God. And we just began with idea, and I think it's a good place to start. Again, and ID theorists, they claim that they have a very special theory. They accept everything about geology. The Earth has its normal age, and the universe has its normal age, and it's even to that level that evolution has its normal development. It's quite odd in that way, but they claim that the actual design, one ingredient in the whole puzzle, is injected by a creator. And in Vedic philosophy, that is where Ashish takes his stance. Design is a subtle material reality that exists as meanings in a subtle body, and that's compromising mind, intelligence, ego, and mahatattva. These meanings are converted into gross matter, which we can observe. The structure and function in matter owe their origin to meanings in the subtle body. Since these meanings are prior to the body, the evolutionary idea that meanings are emergent properties of random transmutation in matter is false from a Vedic standpoint. Meanings in the Vedic view are fundamental, and it is matter that is emergent. The causality in matter is therefore based on the meanings and not based on physical properties. And I noted this is very close to what, for instance, the son of Niels Bohr would say, Ågebor, who pinpointed always that existence is not scientific and should not be mentioned in the study room or the laboratory or discussion halls. He banned the word because it has no place in science. Instead, they are looking at the semantical perspective of the world, and he calls that models or algorithms or equations, constants, so forth. Things with an actual effect. Not only does existence not let itself define, it also doesn't have an effect. It's a bit problematic when it comes to science. And there is another aspect that's quite interesting, and this is also a little bit the same as Ågebor. The law of nature in Vedic philosophy involves both effect and consequences. An effect of a choice is the immediate outcome, such as the bullet being shot by pulling a trigger. A consequence is the reaction to the choice, which compromises three things. First, there is a moral judgment of whether the act was right or wrong. Second, an unconscious impression of the action is formed, which creates a bias in the living entity about what is true and what is false. The false things are the focus, while the biased view of truth is focused again. Third, every action shapes a living entity's personality of desires, likes and dislikes, or what kind of situation he or she feels comfortable in. So it's all down to semantics, and our intention is part of the puzzle. And modern science, and I'd say modern classical science, only studies the effects and completely neglects the consequences, which are the cause of the subsequent bodies. Even the effects are studied based on physical properties rather than on the meanings. And if there are no meanings, then there are no judgments of truth, good and right, and hence there are no consequences. Well, that goes actually together. So the theoretical framework of science preempts many types of causes, but all of these are material and not actions of God. The so-called design in the living entity itself, he or she is designing their own body as a result of consequences created in the past. This is very similar to shape dynamics in the ideas of Maxwell and Mach. And it takes similarity as the cause, or similarity as the foundation of effect. Similarity and effect goes parallel in this case. And this leads Ashish Dalela to propose a different material science. We have now been discussing the Vedic theory of action, effect and consequence, and that has been specifically mentioned in a book he wrote before called Moral Materialism, which also discusses the debate between free will and determinism. And I think that is one of the important things, because, for instance, in the view of Niels Bohr and his son especially, will comes to take a preeminent role, and the reason for that is the role of the observer. When the observer decides the outcome of, for instance, a double slit experiment, the intention and the willing is of course what causes it. And by following that lead, we go from observer to willing, and then we all of a sudden have thinking, thoughts and words. And they are having an effect. And that effect is actually physical. So willing something has an effect. It collapses the superposition. So many people say observance get the superposition to collapse, but it's more an effect, a doing of some sort. And I think it could be helpful to look at Vedic philosophy more in the area of effects, action and forces, whereas Darwinism is more static. It tries to define, and it sees that there is some sort of static space where everything is happening. We discussed that earlier, that evolution is taking place in an empty space. And this is a variety, I propose, of the idea of having an object in space in front of a subject. And we know how that looks in the coordinate system. In the coordinate system, that looks like this. You have the coordinate system. That space, it's immovable, unchangeable, and that makes it possible to have something in it. You can define where it is, because this is not moving, this is possibly moving. And then you have something looking at the whole point, and that is the inertial point of reference, as it's called in, for instance, Newton. Origo, we often refer to it. And Darwin does the same thing more or less. He proposes there is an empty space where a species can develop, having its movement, so to speak, developing, but the surrounding area around the species is completely empty. It's non-active. It doesn't have any forces. So this is what Ashish means, that is a static view. We can also see it this way. It's two factors that are unchangeable. It's the origo, the subject, and you have the space, it's unchangeable. And these two are sort of the background, so anything can move. It can be defined as moving. Darwin does the same thing, but he forgets, as Ashish points out so eloquently, that there are surrounding animals. Actually, it's a whole block of animals. Thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s. And you cannot develop into empty space, because the space is not really empty. It's filled with animals. And he shows an example with a society that's also very similar to the animal kingdom. And if you are a milk producer and decide to produce double amount of milk, you need distributors to distribute that double amount of milk, and you need consumers to double their consumption of milk, and so forth. It's not in empty space. There is an interacting force going on all the time. So the development have to go in global view altogether. That is not explained in Darwin. He just assumes this role. I think it would have been much better if he early on in his writings would have explained, this is how I'm going to explain it like. This is where I start. I'm going to say one thing is immovable, and I'm not going to tell you why this is going to be immovable. It's just going to be unmovable, and the reason is because I need to define something. That's not sound reasoning, I'd say. It's a similar question here when we take up Vedic creationism and intelligent design. There's a bit of a problem here because they try to say the moving object is a little bit like the design being injected by a creator. So everything else is static, the same as in Darwinistic theory. But for some reason, the actual design, nothing else, is injected by a creator. So the natural laws are the same, the environment is the same, the whole universe is the same. But for some reason, God chooses to inject something into the living animals and make them develop. And I think it's an interesting theory in that aspect. It accepts everything in Darwinism, and they want to add something little extra, they think. It's a big problem here, lurking about. It's a better view, it's growing on me actually to see the whole things as different actions, forces. And he also goes on to say, causality in matter is therefore based on the meanings and not based on physical properties. Physical properties have a tendency to not cause anything. They are static and they are inert. A living being, the Vedas describe, enters a specific type of mother's womb at a specific time based on his subtle body, which carries impressions, desires, and karma from his previous lives. And karma is the residue of knowledge. So Vedic viewpoint doesn't accept the clean slate idea. The dominant idea until recently in both science, neurology, and cognition science. The last 10 years, I think it's highly debated because it causes problem to assume clean slate. Clean slate meaning that we are born blank. We don't have anything about the world. We don't know anything. We need to learn everything. And the clean slate has always been assumed. It's also ache into the empty space. Our heads are empty containers for reality to be outside. All the impression comes from the outside. The inside is nothing. It's empty space. It's similar. It is similar. And the reason it caught on is you want to have some sort of static space where everything can be projected like representations. I was born with an empty head, therefore all that is outside could be represented in my head and I can get them together. I don't think there is any reason to assume such a thing. But the thing is, it's never been assumed. It's more an underlying tendency, and those are harder to combat because they are never verbalized, they are never spoken, and how could you even notice them? They, actually in physics they were completely unnoticed until Einstein constructed his general relativity. He realized that there was an unmoving part and he started to move that. He said that space and time actually are changeable. They are relative. And of course this is affected by the event of non-Euclidean space, discovered in the mid-19th century. So that caused all this idea to move about a bit. So he concludes, a brief overview of these ideas above illustrates that adding the notion of design into matter will only address the gap between the physical and biological complexities without an explanation of how this design is embedded in matter. Furthermore, this approach will not explain the existence of mind and meaning in nature. So it's a little bit, when you start that way, you start walking that path, you need to get rid of more and more things. And meaning was the first thing that went, and then later on we had to take away mind as well. And in the end we have to take away the mind that says there is no mind. Somebody's going to stand out and shout outside the house of Daniel Dennett, we need to get rid of you because you're a person who says he has no mind. We need no mind that says there is no mind. Computer that says human beings have no mind. It shouldn't be said by a person. I think that could be the next development. Well, physical theories obviously cannot explain mind, and therefore even if we did postulate an element of design, we would still have to postulate another explanation for mind. Still, intelligent design does not solve that problem. If God provides that design in matter, but that design influences our thinking, feeling and other psychological states, then God's will would seem to interfere with the living's being free and having a free will, and thus lead to other problems of mind and choice. The Vedic approach is more sophisticated because it attributes design to the living beings rather than to God's mind. The body of a living being arises as a consequence of its choices, not the will of God. This, however, requires a more drastic adjustment to our notions about matter than entailed by intelligent design. In intelligent design, matter is adequately described by current laws of nature. That is a thing that's accepted by ID. The laws of nature underdetermine the complexity which is bridged by God's design. In the Vedic view, however, the complexity bridged by the living being's past. The laws that govern the evolution of an observer's experience are the laws of choice. Their consequences create both the body and the mind. The causality therefore goes beyond current science. So we have will into the picture. Will plays a role. Will is the determiner of what happens in the world, or what it's becoming in the world. Will causes things. Will causes things to come to existence. The fine-tuning and design require a designer, which is not the living entity whose body is being designed. In Vedic philosophy, rather, the physical theory is not even partially true. The theory based on meaning is partially true, though. Deeper than these meanings are the unconscious consequences of previous actions. And deeper than these are the choices made by the living entity. So the creation of the body and mind and their successive experiences involves far more complexity than ID postulates. So it's interesting. It's a rather new theory. I think the biggest proponent is Michael Behe and this tall guy, what's his name? I forgot his name. But Michael Behe, and it's odd because they accept almost everything about Darwinism and classical physics, and they try to put in somewhere in this picture design. So that it would be a God who's not capable of changing the physical laws constructed by Newton. It would be a God that not even can. It would be God as an explanation that cannot explain consciousness and free will. So this is a mountain of problems that ID creates. So no wonder people has a big problem with ID, because it's a problem creator. It takes a theory like Darwinism and makes it even more problematic. And to add insult to injury, they don't provide any experiential data, no observable data at all. There's no practice behind it. And of course, there was very good reason for Tony Shamir to criticize it. Well, he didn't even criticize it, he just said it doesn't show anything. That's the point to it. It's just sounds possibly good, but it's words without an effect. In the end, this is also a bit similar to the Wittgensteinian idea of world and word being the same thing. Because in this theory, words, i.e. meanings, are causing what we usually think is physical effects. But since the physical effects are coming from semantic effects, the semantic is more important than the physical. It goes hand in hand with quantum theory that is about physical effects not being important or nonsensical at worst. And what is creating effect is semantics, meanings. Meanings change things. Meaning could be also forces. And I think you know by now that in the Newtonian scheme, and that is by extension also the Darwinian scheme, there are no proper forces. The forces that are in this scheme are deduced from the idea of having in an origo an empty space. they are secondary forces, not in this world, but dependent on a scheme that has an object in empty space that's unmovable, seen by an unmovable subject. And we know reality is not like that. These forces are not in real life. Well, I have to conclude, it was amazingly interesting chapter 4 in this little booklet. Although it's constructed in a way that makes the information very condensed, you really need to have the background to understand it. But it goes for a good start. There are very good points here. And we are actually seeing something very interesting. And the very fact, the force, what actually happens when intelligent design gets too spread out, it will actually push Darwinism forward. And that's because its force goes in exactly the same direction. It shares everything with Darwinism. Only to one point it doesn't share, and that point they can't prove. So it's weakening any argument against Darwinism. It makes Darwinism so much stronger, just by being accepted. So that goes to show that any attack is not really an attack, it could be a support. Well, I think it's time to hit the sack once more. And here from Southern Närke, I say thank you to you have come to listen this late, and I wish you a pleasant good night.
Thank you for